experience a trauma do not develop PTSD. And likewise, children who develop the death of a loved one wouldn't necessarily develop traumatic grief. But it's a far-ranging prevalence rate. So some people say that most children who've experienced a loss will not develop childhood traumatic grief, while others cite prevalence rates as high as 72% of children who have experienced that loss will develop childhood traumatic grief symptoms. I think a lot of that depends on how you measure these symptoms, how you think about traumatic grief, and perhaps the patient populations that we're really looking at this with. And the patient population matters because there are a lot of risk factors for developing traumatic grief once you've experienced the loss. Previous trauma is one of them, and so experiencing a loss can trigger reminders of previous traumatic incidents in your life, make it even more difficult to feel safe and to feel trusting of your environment. They can also make your PTSD reactions much more intense. Prior mental health difficulties in general, so behavioral difficulties as well as anxiety or depression can really contribute to developing traumatic grief. One that I think is really important for us to address as child and adolescent clinicians is the impaired functioning of parents and the family. So what we know is the level of sadness in the home as well as the impairment of parents and their own PTSD symptoms have a lot to do with recovery of children in general. And it's something we address explicitly in PFCBT, which is why it's one of my favorite parts of the model, and we do that as well in CTG, or childhood traumatic grief work. Individuals have poor social support or secondary adversities. What we mean by that is, what if the person who passed away was the primary breadwinner, or the person who was bringing in the financial resources for the family? Not only are you grieving the loss of someone you love, you're trying to figure out how to pay the bills. And while those might be parent concerns, parent worries rub off on children. And many children will say, I don't know how we're going to pay the bills. They've heard their parents talk about this. They see their parents crying over it. They're not quite sure how to make sense of it. Also, the death characteristics can be a risk factor for developing traumatic grief. So what we know is if the child was also in danger, that does increase the risk of traumatic grief happening, as well as if the death was violent in any way. That can also really, as we understandably, make it much more difficult to process what happened. And finally, the degree of closeness to the deceased. In the case example that I'll talk with you about, this kiddo actually experienced 2 deaths in a relatively short period of time. One death from an individual who he wasn't actually that close to, and another death of a person who he was very close to. And we'll talk about how there might be differences in symptoms because of that. So the typical treatment sequence for how you get into childhood traumatic grief is you actually start with TFCBT the way we think about it. So you're going to do your practicals, you're going to do the trauma narrative, you're going to do the cognitive processing, and then get into the really directed childhood traumatic grief component. The reason for that is a lot of times, remember, these trauma symptoms are getting in the way of kids being able to go through the typical bereavement process. So by addressing the PTSD symptoms, just like we do in TFCBT, think of it as freeing the child to then be able to go through these components successfully. And so, briefly, kind of how we integrate traumatic grief into the practicals. So remember, if we're doing TFCBT, we're using gradual exposure. So what that means is we're bringing up the traumatic event in every session. We're talking about it explicitly. We're not referring to it as that thing that happened. We're referring to it as this person passing away, this person dying. I tend to take my language from the family. And so if the family uses the term passing away, that's what I'll use. If the family uses the term dying, that's what I'll use. But what I won't kind of mimic is avoidance language. And so if it's an avoidance kind of language, like, that thing, then we would want to clarify that. So how do we then talk about traumatic grief in the practical? So starting with psychoeducation, we would really want to validate the experience they're having, help parents understand how the current symptoms are understandable given the context of what this child has been through, and help them understand that they're not the only kid who has lost someone that's meaningful to them. And similarly for parents, they're not the only parent who may now be in a single parenting circumstance because they've lost their partner or they've lost their own parent in a circumstance. Then when we get into parenting, typically how we do this is we really give them strategies for managing the impairing behavior that their kids